Wow, that was very rich. I think these two papers together provide on top of Boris's provocation this morning, I think provide a lot of fuel for thought. I want this panel to turn into a discussion about Russia within a globalized context, but I think we have to address these papers first and the different ideas of autonomy that have been proposed. Myself, coming from a Western context, I always think of autonomy being, I think of autonomy today. The problem of autonomy today, as we discussed at the weekend in Eindhoven, is a question of artists regaining some control over the dissemination and production of their work, as against a market on one hand, but also a neoliberal instrumentalization of participatory and collectivist art on the other. Which is an aspect of autonomy that didn't come up in your papers. For David, I can autonomy when you address Osmolovsky's work seems to be a question of sort of a re-education, a self-education against a sort of an appeal against the laziness of our too easily assimilated and regurgitated Western ideas of autonomy through Greenberg and Fried in particular. And Ekaterina is proposing a different idea of autonomy again, which again does not exist in any kind of troubled relationship to the market, I would say. So I guess what I'm arriving at through this question is, what is the horizon of autonomy from your various perspectives? Have I summarized this accurately? And is the market still to be seen as part of that horizon, or is it something we can turn our backs on?
Is it the question to me?
Yeah, why don't you start first?
So my position is of questioning not just the autonomy itself, but the idea of autonomy which does exist. For me, autonomy is not given, but the lack of autonomy is not given either. I'm surprised to see that there are many institutions of art which produce art without autonomy. That's non-autonomous art actually is very autonomous. It has very safe institutional frame which defends it, which has this circle of people who like it. Otherwise, it's not in this vulnerable position of exposing itself to people who don't know it, don't like it, might be different. It's in a very close situation, and it doesn't see it. It's not necessarily bad, but I think it's a delusion that this art is somehow fighting autonomy. I'm coming from I have to recur to this personal thing I hate, but I'm coming from a situation where there were no art institutions, and it's not normal to me. I mean, the institutions. It's something which is good, which might exist, but this is not given. So I simply observe that there are different kinds of art autonomy, and I don't even know which autonomy of art is more autonomous. The one which is on the market, or the one which is, in small, independent, critical institutions. I think they are more autonomous.
I think I was trying to really differentiate between an ideology of bourgeois autonomy that is brought in as also a legitimation for object-based, painting-based practices. When you go to an exhibition in Russia today, even an exhibition that, for an example, would be about utopia, there was one recently in a new art space, you would see a very traditional exhibition, one that has really paintings and objects. It's just painting and sculpture. And this is not that I have anything against old art that is working in painting and sculpture, but I just think that today, to reinstate this with an obvious ideology that is completely just that falls into itself, it doesn't make any sense. So my alternative to that would be really a collective autonomy of artists, intellectuals who are looking at art without paying attention to these ideologies, without actually seeing objects that you could buy yourself, but seeing objects, things, comrade things that narrate the struggles of the past and that allow a retroactive solidarity. I mean, this to me would be autonomy of artists who are able to do this despite extremely repressive conditions. I mean, of course, we're not living when I referred to Peter Weiss, I wasn't saying so clearly that when we live in Russia in Nazi Germany. This is clear, but the conditions are very repressive, and it's very important for artists to try to see something other than this bourgeois autonomy. And I think Osmalovsky plays a key role because he provokes, even though maybe he's doing this ideological move and importing something in a very naive kind of way, or maybe it's not so naive. He's really, is it? Oh yeah. He's really provoking, I would say, a formation of the latter type, but maybe also against himself. It's something that would then challenge his own ideologies. That's really what I was saying.
Boris, would you like to contribute to this discussion on autonomy? Because one of the conclusions of our discussion on Sunday is that we need a new working definition of autonomy, and I wondered if you'd managed to invent one in the last 4 days.
Yeah, maybe because if you look at the historical context of this, where the concept of autonomy emerged, also early Greenberg and so on and so on, you had at that time very homogeneous space of Western capitalism, yeah. And in this space, in this art market, and also including art institution, whatever, what was autonomous was avant-gardist work of art. So not painting and not sculpture per se, but very specific artistic objects, avant-gardist objects that were discommunicative, that didn't want to subject themselves to certain rules. That was space and place of autonomy. So very, very specific object. Now, this idea was in decline during the Cold War because we had two different systems. An obvious engagement of all participants in one way or another in relationship to both of the systems. So this idea of autonomy was down, was declining. It seems to me that now it emerges again, de facto. It emerges again not in terms of participation in art market, not in terms of participation in art institution, but because some artists try, as a regulative idea, as a desire to create spaces that would be alternative to the homogenized space of capitalist order. So we have again very homogenic space worldwide. We don't have this engagement, we don't have these camps, we don't have this struggle. And I think that brings us to the idea of reformulation concept of autonomy, not in terms of painting and sculpture, but in terms of creating certain space where alternative social experimentation would take place. And that space is autonomous in a sense that it tries to be isolated away from this homogeneous general space. I think if people speak about autonomy now, they have something like that in mind. Of course, not as Osmalovsky maybe, but I mean generally.
I think it's very interesting because it leads us away from a medium-specific approach to thinking about autonomy, that certain mediums are no longer valid or no longer cutting edge, and also away from the Walter Benjamin idea that a work of art is better the more it resembles an apparatus that allows more people to participate. So, but talking about kind of homogenization of a space for the exhibition of art worldwide, I'd like to ask you all a question about the Moscow Biennial and the way in which you understand its impact within the Moscow scene, and whether this, because biennials, as they proliferated so much since the early 1990s, they've gone hand in hand with the period of time that we're focusing on in the Former West project, and hand in hand with a globalization, with globalized economy. But biennials have, in various contexts, have served different purposes. That sometimes they serve as a substitute for an existing institutional infrastructure and pave the way for that kind of infrastructure. In that respect, they can be seen as quite progressive. On the other hand, they can serve value systems that are quite remote from cultural production and intellectual research. So, can I ask you about the Moscow Biennial and how you would position this within a panorama of biennials and its impact?
Well, I must say, frankly, I don't think that biennials are interesting anymore, in principle. I would say it's over. It will happen, and it's okay, and it brings opportunities, possibilities to see art, but it's not something where interesting things are happening. Because, together several international artists on a huge budget to bring their works to a city to increase its touristic potential, because that's what biennials are now all about. It will happen, but it's not the place where things be happening, so to speak. That's why I'm critical of Moscow Biennial in principle, and the third one in particular. But I wouldn't waste, my time and my, thinking capacities, which are in decline, to think about it. That's not okay. It brought so many visitors to the garage, and let's forget about it. I think that things are going in a different direction to make, instead of biennial, something else. So I was now interested by the project of Massimiliano Gioni to make a biennial on the topic of human face. So I forgot, in Gwangju or somewhere. Which means basically a thematic exhibition with lots of historical material, also non-art material on a very conservative topic as human face, which would be probably more accessible to the general public than the notion of dialectics of hope, for example, as the Russian Moscow Biennial would be. So it's an interesting move. So we're also thinking of one new biennial with David, but this Moscow Biennial, I wouldn't put that much hope into it in general. Let's forget about it.
May I not forget about it?
Yeah.
I just have because I think actually the one important reason to remember this Moscow Biennial is because it shows quite a not only how the normalization of the Putin years has sort of progressed and the phases it's gone through, but also how biennials generally work. I mean, the first biennial was very ephemeral, very immaterial. It made a great gesture by having the main exhibition venue on Red Square, and this was claimed as a sort of revolutionary gesture by its commissar, who had claimed his sovereignty in a very kind of, let's putting it diplomatically, in an exceptional way. The commissar of the biennial declared that today the trams was still going, but the revolution had already occurred, so to speak, and everything would now be changed. The second biennial was very interesting because it was in an office tower. An unfinished office tower, and the location itself seemed to speak about, this image of Moscow becoming one of those cities that would be looking like Dubai pretty soon. And you could see actually while you were looking at art objects, and it was a very object-based biennial, I have to say, as I remember it now, already then. You could see this work around you, and then you could look out of the window and you could see the real work of the migrant laborers who are actually building these towers. Now you have the third biennial that is actually already in an established space. The space is a former Melnikov garage, bus depot. A really architectural masterpiece that has been taken over by Roman Abramovich's girlfriend or fiancée, Dasha Zhukova. I don't use the term girlfriend derogative way at all, because you're laughing. It's not funny, actually. She is his girlfriend or his fiancée. This space is really already an established institutional space that then the biennial came in. Itself quite an interesting topic, actually, because it was a remake of an exhibition that took place 20 years ago, in a sense, of Magicien de la Terre by Jean-Hubert Martin. And here you see an image of globalization that was actually much more regressive in some ways than what you had in the first two. The first biennial showed you the world of contemporary art and placed it on Red Square, practically. The second biennial showed you how contemporary art somehow relates to this new Dubaization of Moscow. The third biennial showed you that actually this is not, all of this was not globalization. Actually, globalization is a certain diffuse creativity that could be applied to any artistic production, also the artistic production that is coming out of a non-contemporary, non-Western context, and that is seen with a very colonial gaze, actually, of a Western curator. So you had this real, and this was the one that was the most successful. This was the one that created an audience, actually, more than any others. I mean, I'm sorry for going into this boring memories, but
no, I think it's
very symptomatic for the situation in Moscow as a whole.
It's still unimportant.
No, I think it's very useful what you've done to describe the three different biennials. I'm just going to ask Boris one thing, and then we're going to open it to the audience.